the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Delighted to see you all tonight for what will be the final program in our China series for the fall. Before we begin, we are on the record tonight. We're encouraging social media. We are live streaming, so feel free to text your friends if they're at home. Do silence your phones if you would, please. The archive of our live streams are on YouTube, and the audio from all our events is also online. It's perfect for watching and listening at the gym or on the drive, so I encourage you to check that out. The ability to host our events in person here or archiving them online is made possible from our members. We thank you who are members tonight. If you're not a member, please feel free to come and find me afterward. I'm happy to chat about the benefits. Turning back to tonight, we're delighted again to be working with the U.S.-China Business Council. There's a handout on the back on the registration area that has some information from their most recent report. Their website also has a wealth of information on U.S.-China relations and business ties. So if you're interested in learning more about the topics we're talking about tonight, I encourage you to check out their site. Now to introduce our speakers tonight, I'm delighted to welcome to the stage financial advisor at Morgan Stanley Wealth Management and a valued member of the council who has spent considerable time in China, Mr. Alex Ross.
Thank you. Thanks, John. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming out today on a blustery October evening. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for today's very timely discussion on devaluations, markets, and industry in China. For the fifth straight year, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has partnered with the U.S.-China Business Council to discuss the latest trends concerning China trade politics, the business climate in China, Beijing's interaction in the market, and Chinese firms expanding into the West. Recent political events have caused uncertainty for both American and Chinese companies conducting business in each other's nations. China's recent economic reforms, pending regional trade deals, and a consistently shifting business climate remain challenges to the U.S.-China relationship. Furthermore, Americans will be heading to the polls to elect a new president, and this will no doubt be a major topic of the debates. These disruptions have strained U.S.-China relations and have prompted both President Xi Jinping and President Barack Obama to voice their concerns, while also reassuring bilateral relations between the two nations. This evening, I look forward to hearing our panelists' insights on the changes that American business leaders should expect from China's economic reforms, and also how Chinese businesses are starting to look west. You have your speakers' bios in front of you, but please allow me to offer a brief introduction of each. John Frisbee has been the president of U.S.-China Business Council since 2004, and he has more than 25 years of experience in business and government relations in China. Dali Yang is the William Claude Rivas Professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. He is also the non-resident senior fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. John Box is a partner in Sidley & Austin Chicago office and has previously practiced in the firm's Tokyo and London offices. And last but not least, Phil Levy is the senior fellow on the global economy at the Chicago Council and was senior economist for trade for President Bush's Council of Economic Advisors. And with that, please join me in a warm welcome to our panelists.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. We've got a lot of interesting things to discuss. We've got some great expertise to do it, so I wanted to jump right in. So let's start, John, with this report, where we now actually have data and actual information updated about what is on the minds of the U.S.-China Business Council members. So maybe you could tell us first who are the members of the U.S.-China Business Council and what is particularly interesting that you found in this latest version of your report.
Sure, Phil, and I want to give my thanks to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for once again partnering to do this program. It's been my pleasure and the U.S.-China Business Council's pleasure to be able to do this every autumn. I guess it's been every time in the last 5 years. It's really good that you're willing to host this and put it together, and I look forward to hearing everybody's remarks on this panel. View of the U.S.-China business community. I think too often the headlines miss something that's very important to keep in mind, and that is China, my back of the envelope these days, is a $400 billion market for American companies. Our membership in the U.S.-China Business Council is about 200 American companies, mostly larger names that you would recognize, but a very diverse membership as well. It's manufacturing, services, also resources and agriculture, and it's all U.S. companies. We survey our membership every year, and that's been sort of the driver behind these programs we've been doing. But I think it's really important for everyone to keep in mind that number I said, $400 billion market, significant, much different than it was 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago. China makes and has a much bigger impact on companies now than it ever did before. China shows up in earnings calls on Wall Street, and that was not happening very much, probably even 5 years ago, but certainly not 10 years ago. So as we look ahead, it's the U.S. and China that are going to be basically the two drivers of global growth. And it's been that way with China's contribution already over the last 5 years. That growth, however, I think as you all know from the headlines, in China is moderating. And we certainly see that in our survey results. Our companies have shown that their revenue projections and growth projections have come down in line with China's GDP growth slowdown. That's not a surprise. China actually is now completing the last year of its current 5-year plan. They're about to launch a new one. And they had set a 7% GDP growth target for this 5-year plan that's ending right now, which is about where they're at. So it's not like the slowdown has been a surprise. But nonetheless, for companies who have seen double-digit revenue growth year over year, many times close to 20%, to have that come down to upper single digits, it makes a difference. It makes an impact. And our membership has certainly seen that. I think projections in our survey by companies for this year, about 2/3 said they would see revenue growth. About 13% said they'd see flat. 20% though said they'd see a revenue decline. So there's definitely a different environment over there. But China isn't a monolith, I think, as you all know. Certain sectors are doing better than others. Consumer demand is holding up pretty well. Healthcare is another one I would point to, for example, sector that's doing well. On the side that's perhaps challenged, infrastructure, because China has slowed down its build out, its real estate market as well. So that would be one. Materials, there's been a lot of overcapacity in the materials sector that's vexing to a lot of American companies too. And technology would be another one where there's some challenges. A lot of those are politically driven more than anything else, I would say. But continued growth in China is likely. And I say that because there's many economists who see China's middle class of roughly, 300 million people now by the definition used, doubling over the next decade to 600 million people. If you even take China at 6% annual GDP growth over the next decade, you're still adding 2 Germanys, the equivalent of 2 Germanys, to their economy. So it matters. Growth will be there. U.S. companies need to be engaged there if they can be, and I think that's the important caveat. Can U.S. companies access that growth as fully as they should be able to, given the various market access barriers and other things that are there? Some of the top issues in our survey on the operating side, something I've talked about here before, is continuing, and that is rising costs in China. It's no longer the low-cost manufacturing center that it was probably for many companies, but rising costs, principally HR costs, people costs, and rising competition from Chinese companies. And when you have that environment, rising costs, rising competition, what do you get? Profit margin squeeze. Very clear. Companies are still profitable. I think 85% of our survey respondents say they're profitable. That's very consistent over the last decade, but margins are coming down with those 2 pressures. That's on the operating side. On the policy side, the big takeaway from our survey is something else we've been seeing, a clear trend line over the last 4 years, and that is what I would call moderating optimism. And I say that carefully because we always ask our companies, how do you see the next 5 years? Optimistic, somewhat optimistic, neutral, somewhat pessimistic, pessimistic. Pessimism numbers remain low, single digits. It's not a pessimistic group, but it is a group that has seen its optimism go from, 60+% of the respondents down to 20, 25, 30%, and somewhat optimistic growing in its place. And that softening confidence has been a very clear trend line, about 10 percentage points a year. And to me, it's showing a erosion of confidence right now in China's policy direction and whether those barriers I mentioned earlier will indeed be addressed. And that's a big and important takeaway from the survey this year, that uncertainty about the direction China's going. That was the backdrop for President Xi's visit in September, and I would say uncertainty in the relationship across the board. I just mentioned it in the business context about the reform direction in China, and a lot of questions whether China's reforms would indeed have more openings and address some of the level playing field issues. But with China's economic slowdown in the summer, we had seen stock market gyrations and a rather heavy-handed response. There was a currency move that caught people by surprise. It just led to a lot of questions around, was China managing this slowdown in a way that was going to keep it from a hard landing? So there was uncertainty on that part of it. But then there was also a lot of uncertainty in the strategic relationship, whether it was the South China Sea or whether it was cybersecurity, you name it. Our advice to President Xi's top advisors, I went out in August before he came, expressly for that reason, was that he needed to address this uncertainty. That was the biggest top-line thing he could do while here. And I would say on that front that the visit was judged to be pretty successful. It exceeded people's expectations going into it, because he came over. He did take on each one of those issues and tried to address them. He didn't duck them in his speeches and in the joint session with President Obama in front of the media and the fact sheets that came out. I think it shows the value of annual summits as well, presidential summits, and something that the U.S.-China Business Council has been pushing too. So the words were all right, I think, but what's going to matter is the action, the follow-ons in the months ahead. You know, will the relationship indeed be stabilized and go forward more solidly, or is this kind of like propping the balloon up a little bit and then only to see it sag again? And we don't know the answer to that yet. But in terms of the visit itself, I think it, as I said, exceeded expectations. And President Xi clearly came with an objective of trying to improve the relationship. And I think that in itself was positive too, given a lot of the uncertainties going into it, including on the strategic side. He clearly heard the business community's view in Seattle. We co-hosted an event there for him, a large event at which he gave the policy speech of his visit. But there was also CEO roundtable that Hank Paulson chaired that I was a part of. There were 15 stellar CEOs from each side, and it was a pretty open discussion, and the CEOs were pretty clear in ticking off what the concerns were in a constructive way. But President Xi heard this in an unfiltered way, which I think was important, and he was paying close attention. So I think it was a good opportunity for the business community to express some of the concerns that I mentioned during that time as well. And there were some positive outcomes from the visit. Cybersecurity got attention. We'll see if that's going to make a difference in that particular issue, and we can come back to that if we want. But I think the one issue I would point to from the list that saw progress was the bilateral investment treaty. It's the negotiations between the U.S. and China on that. I don't want to dive too much into the weeds here, but the reason that negotiation is important is it gets at some of those issues I just mentioned. It's market openings that would come through removing investment barriers in China. It is level playing field because it has national treatment provisions that would be very important for U.S. companies operating there. That's why it's an agreement that I think matters enormously to the business community. Before President Xi came, we actually partnered with Hank Paulson, the Paulson Institute, to have a CEO letter go to both presidents, commenting how important the bilateral investment treaty would be. We had nearly 100 CEOs sign on to it, and some pretty impressive names on there, everybody from Warren Buffett to Jim McNerney to Mark Zuckerberg. It was a pretty diverse group, but if there's any doubt about the business community's support for this agreement, it was Clinton sending a clear signal to both capitals, Washington, D.C. as well as Beijing. This is something that's a high priority. It needs to be a high standard agreement, but it's really something that I felt was coming out of the visit got momentum because it was the first thing President Obama mentioned in the press conference in the Rose Garden as an outcome. The two sides agreed to accelerate those negotiations. We'll see what they can get. There's a year left in the Obama administration. But I think that we have to look at the bit in the context of a stepping stone to China being in the Trans-Pacific Partnership at some point. But the last thing I would say about it is this, why we're putting so much importance on it. Given there are questions on China's reform policies and whether they'll go forward with more bold openings or not, the bilateral investment treaty is intimately linked to that reform debate in China, because there is a debate that's going on between those who want more openings in China versus those who want more government control. The pace of reforms has been very slow so far in the 3 years since President Xi came into office. There's not a consensus over there. There's a lot of resistance. The bilateral investment treaty is one way perhaps to force that forward, but it's also a way to test whether there's that ambition in China to really make some big changes in their economy.
I want to come back to the bilateral investment treaty. Before we get there, because it is an important topic, before we get there, Dolly, let me bring you in on this. So we have a picture, we've just heard, of some uncertainty about China's trajectory, moderating optimism, perhaps. This is in the context where there had been, I think, a fair degree of optimism. But I guess you need that if it's going to moderate. But things like the third-party plenum talking about a major role for market forces. How does this sort of comport with your view of China's trajectory?
Well, let me build on what John has articulated. I think you provide a very comprehensive picture, especially in terms of U.S. business views of China and the operating environment in China. And a lot of those are also felt in China, in fact, partly because the circumstances have indeed changed, if we use somewhat of a legal term in this case. At this very moment, in fact, there are three sets of meetings that are happening. One is actually the annual meeting, the Central Committee Plenum. This is the plenary meeting of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. This is the fifth plenum of the 18th Central Committee. And this is important because this is the time when the leadership has largely consolidated. They are also beginning to look forward to the next Central Committee, the 19th. And for Xi, actually, he's been very busy over the last 3 years, anti-corruption, rectifying the military. All of those occupied a lot of his energy in many ways. So that's one set of meetings. But at the same time, the major issue on the agenda is the 13th five-year plan. I'll come back to this very briefly. The second meeting, actually, is the bilateral investment treaty. The U.S. and China are negotiating, I think, at this point in the city of Qingdao, in my hometown, practically, in this case, in discussing, actually, some of the following up on the meetings. So in other words, the talks in D.C. and Seattle were not idle talks. They are being followed up. And I think that's very important because a major President Xi's visit to the U.S. was vastly overshadowed by two other people. John Bolton, he was shedding tears as he announced he was quitting his speaker's position. So that was major news. The other one was Pope Francis, and even President Xi recognizes that he cannot compete against the Pope. So he settled for that, but at the same time, the visit was very important in mitigating some of the uncertainty that John has emphasized. But at the same time, in building a foundation for further dialogue and so on. So that's, in the business sector, I think this is extremely important, actually. So the third meeting, actually, is the commander of the Pacific Fleet is headed to China as well. As all of you probably have read about this, actually, the U.S. Navy has been taking what's known as the freedom of navigation, a trip around some of the artificial islands that China has been building in recent months. And that's extremely important in terms of strategic considerations. But it also actually really exacerbates some of the tensions in terms of the relations between the two countries. I'm not saying who is exacerbating the tensions. Obviously, China started building those islands or artificial structures first. But of course, both countries are accusing each other of doing things that they should not be doing. But the fact, however, is that the commander of the Pacific Fleet is traveling to China, again, talking about how also to avoid misunderstandings and to talk to each other about how to have a better relationship. I think both, actually, the three sets of meetings, therefore, are very important in terms of thinking about both the domestic Chinese political sphere, the international strategic issues that the two countries are concerned about, and also the issue of the commercial, how companies can have better relations, a better operating environment. I think, of course, some of those, there are a lot of details that are happening. But I think, first of all, in terms of what John has mentioned, 2-3 years ago, you go to China, you get the sense that China had made it. There was the China model. China had a model that allowed the country to concentrate its resources and organizational capacity to deliver. And that's one of the major reasons why China has made it so far, is either the largest or the second largest economy, depending on how you count. And there was a sense, and this issue, you come from behind, China had been down for such a long time, the psychology of suddenly, oh, we are making it. Today you go to China, however, that's no longer, that sense of, almost like a sense of hubris to some extent is no longer there. Certainly no overconfidence, especially after this wild trip in the stock market this year. In fact, I think actually that's healthy in many ways in terms of psychology. Sometimes we need to be taught some lessons, in this case. But in the Chinese case, I study how institutions develop the leadership issues. If we look back 30, 40 years, China made the best reforms when the Chinese leadership are under pressure. So suddenly today, as they grappled with the stock market, it's almost like a crash. But it's really, if you really look at raw numbers, there's no crash. The Chinese stock market is up significantly from the beginning of the year. But for the middle class, there was a major crash, surprisingly. So in that sense, actually, suddenly that overconfidence is gone. And of course, there are a lot of issues. And the confidence in the ability of the government to deliver is no longer as solid as before. And it's when you have those kind of situations, in fact, the leaders are more serious about reform. And this actually combines with the dialogue about the bilateral investment treaty. And I want to conclude on this because the Chinese leadership also feels like suddenly you have the U.S. has led in these negotiations for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And of course, China originally was very skeptical. They were thinking, well, maybe you couldn't even conclude the treaty. Now the U.S. and our partners have been able to do it. Then many people in China are concerned. In fact, originally there was a lot of criticism this was the U.S. way to exclude China. But actually, you go to China, you talk with people on the left and right, in many ways, the views are very divided. Some people do think that this is the U.S. way to say, well, essentially China has not been playing by the rules as much after China joined the WTO. Therefore, the U.S. needs to have a new venue so that actually can elevate the rules of the game for trade and so on. Now, let's keep in mind that when China joined the WTO in 2001, the leadership, in fact, was very determined to do it, partly also because the Chinese leadership had great difficulty in promoting reforms within. And in that context, they decided that they really needed the deal because that's by signing the WTO, they also can force various reforms, and they did. But of course, once you joined, they began to relax, especially as China began to own the game domestically in many areas, in fact. Today, you go to China again, the reforms are beginning to say, well, maybe the TPP is a way also to a way for us to think about how we can do better, especially because actually it elevates the game in various areas, including the environment in terms of the state-owned enterprises. Now, China itself has also changed because in 2001, China was still based on the old model, cheap labor, cheap land, lax regulation. All of that actually is sort of, today that's no longer the case. John emphasized how human resources costs have risen. Land prices are no longer cheap. Environmental regulations have been strengthened. China actually already itself is beginning to change. So in that sense, actually the TPP, those ideas are no longer simply seen as trying to fend China off because some of those, for reformers in China, the objectives of the TPP, some of them are what China should aspire. And that's actually interesting. One of the major issues is the role of the government. Number one, there have been many vested interests that have developed in China. So over the last 2 and 3 years, in fact, as part of the anti-corruption campaign, the Chinese leadership has been able practically to browbeat some of the key vested interests, the petroleum companies, the power sector. Those major enterprises that have become mini empires of their own today somehow are very much quieter. They are actually following the rules much better than before. And that actually is, in many ways, is very interesting in terms of thinking about reform down the road, even though there are a lot of complaints about to what extent they are committed to state enterprise reforms. I think actually it's in this context, and let me conclude here, is actually the connection between what the Chinese government is trying to do and the BIT, the Bilateral Investment Treaty, and also the TPP come together. Because over the last 2 or 3 years, as Chinese leadership recognized you cannot simply stimulate the economy by massively a lot of new investments. What can you do? You reform the government, you change the rules, you build the rule of law. The fourth plenum of the Central Committee was emphasizing certainly a law-based governance. Not necessarily rule of law, but certainly rule by law in many ways. And first of all, I do think it's very important to have some law rather than no law. And in this context, Premier Li Keqiang in particular has been emphasizing reducing the number of government approval items significantly. And he has been pushing for that. He was trained in law and then in economics. And here is what he has produced, in fact. Interestingly, he's been reducing taxes for smaller businesses and also eliminating a lot of the approvals. As a result, the number of new business registrations in 2014 increased by 46%. A lot of those are in the business sector in particular. So that's actually very interesting in many ways. Today in China, you can easily buy something online. The delivery could be the same day in major cities and so on. Again, a lot of changes in this area. And finally, in terms of the TPP, in terms of the bilateral investment treaty, which the US and China have been talking about, is this what's known as the negative list. In China, it's been the principle that if the Chinese government does not explicitly grant you to do something, you can't do it in the past. But with the BIT, a major item on the docket between the two countries is to have a list of negatives, what you cannot do. And then whatever is not on the list, you can do. China has explicitly emphasized, already said, by 2018, the Chinese government would itself has a negative list. So I think actually there is real seriousness in China's talking about the BIT and of course in thinking about the TPP even. So on that note, I think I detect significant frustrations with what has happened in China, but also growing commitment to thinking about China has to reform.
Thank you. John, I want to turn to you. So we're talking about this U.S.-China economic relationship, one that's sort of colored in part by the degree to which you have sort of market forces or a government role that's moderating a bit. Your expertise lies most in sort of how this gets reflected in the United States when you have these Chinese firms, one sort of byproduct of a trading relationship where China has sold a great deal of goods and accumulated large reserves, is you now have a lot of interest in investment in the United States. Can you say a bit about what the experience has been? How is it different for a Chinese firm to come and invest in the United States as opposed to, say, a British firm investing in the United States?
Well, let me start by talking about what the experience has been and kind of what the trends have been and kind of tie that into the comments that were made earlier. First of all, I think that there has been a government push for Chinese companies to invest outside of China for some time now. But I think that what we're seeing in the last year or two is an acceleration of real activity and real deal flow, things that are actually getting done. And I think that two of the points that you made, I think, are relevant to that. One is that there has been a reduction in the approvals that are required. So it's actually easier, particularly for deals under $1 billion, for Chinese companies to go out to do acquisitions without having to go through a cumbersome approval process back in China, which in turn affects their ability to be taken seriously as a bidder in any kind of a bidding process here. I think the second thing that you mentioned that I think, and this is the part that I find really interesting, is that China is changing, right? And so the focus of the Chinese investors that we see is changing as well. And there is, originally, I think what people saw coming out of China was, some very high profile deals like Lenovo buying the laptop business of IBM, a lot of resource-oriented investment, most of which was actually targeted outside the United States. But now what we're seeing are are Chinese companies that are intensely interested in technologies, in acquiring know-how that can be utilized in the changing economy in China. So clean energy is obviously an example. There's a real need for better environmental protection in China, and the technology for some of what hopefully is the solution to that can come from the United States. But U.S. companies by themselves aren't really able to go over and implement those solutions. So you find investment opportunities there. You also see this in the tech space and in IT. And so I think that in general, what we're seeing is an increase in activity. That increase in activity has not abated, even as we have seen the economic news coming out of China, even as we have seen the stock market gyrations. And I think that the expectation is that and certainly if you read, there was an Economist article recently that talked about, I think, that the foreign direct investment out of China in 2014 was almost equal to the foreign direct investment into China, and that there are expectations that that's going to continue to grow. The second part of your question, though, I think, was what kind of challenges do Chinese companies face? And the first one, and maybe this is stating the obvious, but as lawyers, I think we tend to get sort of caught up in the laws and the treaties and things like that. But I think that probably the biggest challenge is it may very well be the same challenge that your constituents face in doing business in China, which it's just an entirely different system. And the getting in place the personnel, the management, the ability to actually succeed at a business level, I think is probably the biggest challenge for Chinese companies. And I don't know whether, John, whether you would say maybe U.S. companies are certainly, they've been doing business in China longer, they may be further up the curve, but certainly what I hear from our clients is that, personnel, for example, it's a huge challenge. That's a challenge here too. There's a huge culture gap between Chinese companies that aren't used to doing business in the U.S. And the kind of people that they really need to be able to execute on a business plan here. This is not, I don't think in any country, it's really not a recipe for success to go in and try to apply the same business practices that you've applied in your home country. Certainly not a recipe for success to do that in countries with business systems, with legal systems, with cultures as different as we have in the U.S. and China. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, so I was saying, when you had a useful distinction when you were, I think we were talking about sort of operational difficulties and policy issues. So I think what you were just describing as cultural differences probably goes down to how easy is it to operate once you get in. What about some of the policy side questions? We've had sort of reviews if a Chinese firm wants to come in. There was a story in the paper today about what's potentially the biggest acquisition of a U.S. company. It hasn't happened yet. It's sort of just being discussed. But this is the potential bid by a Chinese company to take over Starwood Hotels and Resorts, which could be on the order of $12 billion or more. Mm-hmm. What would be the considerations in a transaction like that? Is it obvious that Chinese companies can do this? Have they encountered obstacles in the U.S.? And I want to then come back to say, what are the obstacles that U.S. companies face in China? But for the moment, let's look in the U.S.
Yeah, so thinking about the M&A perspective of this, because that's where, I mean, I think you're referring to CFIUS, which has clearly been a big issue.
The Committee on Foreign Investment in the
That's
United
right,
States.
the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. And several Chinese companies have run into issues at CFIUS that have blocked their ability to complete transactions that they were looking to complete. I think that it is, I think to start with, I think there may be a misunderstanding about, the requirement to go through the CFIUS process. It's actually as a legal matter, it's a voluntary filing.
So nominally, CFIUS this is a process that's set up to protect U.S. national security.
It is absolutely, that's right, thank you. It is a process that's designed to protect U.S. national security. U.S. national security is defined quite broadly, and it includes things that might not be obvious to people who haven't thought about it, but clearly, if you're talking about things that involve infrastructure, movement of energy, movement of goods and services around the country, as well as the more obvious things like, military applications and things like that, then CFIUS has an interest in a transaction, and they can, if they choose to do so, initiate an investigation on their own if the parties don't file. So as a practical matter, certainly for Chinese state-owned enterprise, and there's a distinction in the process between, as a practical matter, I don't think there's a distinction in the law, but as a practical matter, there's a distinction between the scrutiny that state-owned enterprises in China are put to in transactions that they're trying to do versus what privately owned businesses can do. Go ahead.
I want to come back on this, but first, Dolly, let me ask you a question. Is it clear which firms in China are state-owned versus entirely private? I know that with companies such as Huawei, this has been a discussion in the U.S. government.
Sure.
Huawei will tell you it is not a state-owned firm, but there's been suspicion publicly voiced by the U.S. government that it looks like there's a lot of state influence. What's a useful way to think about this?
Well, I think the easiest way is actually to think about to what extent are they majority owned by a Chinese government. And when we talk about state ownership, it's not simply one particular entity. Industrial companies, for example, tend to be under the umbrella of the State Assets Supervision and Administration Commission. So there are central government-owned entities. There are local government-owned entities. Financial firms are separately owned. But then there are the issue, so even private enterprises, however, could be getting a lot of liquidity and credit, and they may be strongly influenced or helped by local governments. And then, for example, a company such as Lenovo is a good example. Lenovo essentially was a private company, but originally I think it started with something like 50,000 yuan renminbi from the Chinese Academy of Sciences. The Chinese Academy of Sciences is a state entity, but it's a research entity. So to that extent, the boundary between private and public becomes very ambiguous, in fact. What if a company is owned by a university? For example, Tsinghua Uni Group is owned by Tsinghua University. Tsinghua University, of course, is a national university, but Chinese universities, of course, the government can appoint people to lead the university, but at the same time, it tends to operate fairly hands-off in terms of enterprises. But then there are universities and universities. Tsinghua University itself, however, has very powerful ties to the Chinese leadership. So therefore, the company that's affiliated with Tsinghua may be acting on behalf of the state. So I think actually it's not as easy, but generally speaking, it's about ownership.
Okay. That sounds challenging. I think we've adequately conveyed the complexity of the situation.
That's right.
So John, you're saying that it hinges on, if we could sort this out, this would make a difference in terms of how welcome they might be as investors, and presumably this depends on the sector a fair bit as well.
That's right. So to go back to the Starwood example, and I don't know anything about the transaction other than what was in what was reported in the paper. It is as many people know, and as I think as was noted in the article, a Chinese company bought the Waldorf Astoria, and they did go through the CFIUS process, and that transaction was cleared. It's just from a lawyer's perspective, there's no obvious reason why a purchase of a hotel chain, right, would present national security concerns. But I think that when you combine the precedent of having gone through this for another deal, and the fact that the entities that are mentioned in the article are clearly state-controlled enterprises, I think that the expectation of someone was quoted in the article as saying they would go through a CFIUS process. The expectation is they would go through, but there's no obvious reason why that transaction would raise any national security concerns that would ultimately block.
Is it costly to go through that process?
It's costly. It's not so costly in terms of, at least from a legal perspective, I don't think we consider it to be so costly in terms of dollars. What it is, it's costly in terms of, from the Chinese bidder's perspective, in terms of what they have to do to succeed in a competitive bidding process. And that's a bigger issue if you have a situation where the owners have made a decision to sell, right? And they need to then get on with it, right? And they're faced with at least a delay, and always the possible uncertainty that something could go wrong in the process, either because political influence is brought to bear, or because there are national security issues that just aren't obvious on their face. And so I think it does make it much harder, again, in most sales situations that I've been involved in, they are competitive bidding situations. It makes it harder for the Chinese company to ultimately prevail, and they have to do something more, which probably
Could I
means
add to
more.
this?
I
I think,
want to come to you on what U.S. firms face going into China.
yeah, one of the challenges in the past is the Chinese companies tend to think of the CFIUS process as an afterthought. And I think over time they have learned, and also with legal counsel and so on, they have learned actually it's better to start early,
Right.
to stay engaged with the process. And of course, in the case of the hotel business, actually the award of Astoria, if there is one trophy hotel that's strategic, the president, when he goes to visit the UN, or the US president, he tends to stay there. In fact, this year he did not stay there. And in fact, the company that did purchase Ward of Astoria, Anbang, is a newly started insurance company that has very deep political ties back in China. So I think actually they did the right thing in going through the process, making the rounds, and also paving the way. In fact, I think it's much easier to contemplate the acquisition of a chain like Starwood with 1,200 hotels. And it's a great time for the Chinese because Chinese tourists made 100 million trips last year. It's truly astounding, domestically and internationally. And of course, what better to do if you are serving your own population who are traveling abroad than by providing the hotels that they travel to. So in that sense, it's a great proposition, especially for a hotel chain that's currently also thinking that they have not been doing as a good job in terms of expanding in recent years.
Good. So, John, I want to come to you. When we think of sort of a well-functioning investment regime, one of the things we would hope for is sort of transparency and predictability. When your membership looks towards China, do you think they see that? And this is all, I've promised you all I'm coming back to the BIT, because I know everyone was very excited about the BIT. So we're coming back to the bilateral investment treaty. But as a sort of, as laying the groundwork for that, is there clarity in terms of where you can invest in China and what you need to do to invest if you're an American firm of the sort that constitute your membership?
There actually is a fair amount of clarity.
Okay.
And there always has been, going back to my time 20 years ago, working for GE, and we were looking at opportunities around. China's always maintained to your point, a positive list, if you will, of sectors that foreigners can invest in. But they maintain foreign ownership restrictions in many of those sectors that cut across manufacturing, automobiles, foreign company, Ford, GM, at most can own 50% of what they do there. Now, they're doing very well, but they kind of view that 50% that's going to their partner as a tax on the business because they're bringing a lot of that expertise and everything else. Cloud computing, 50% cap. Financial services and banking, 20-25%. And some of the insurance areas, 49-50% cap. All these limit, in effect, what an American company can do in China, and they serve as market barriers at the end of the day. They're in agricultural sectors and so on. There's about 100 of these areas that we keep tabs on, and that's precisely what's a big part of this negotiation on this treaty is trying to reduce those barriers to some kind of an equivalency with what we have here in the United States, which has relatively few limitations on where foreign companies can invest. So that's a big part of this negotiation that's been going I happen to think, in the U.S.-China Business Council perspective on this ownership question, I don't get so hung up on state-owned enterprises necessarily as the focus of where we ought to be watching out for. I think it's competition with Chinese companies writ large. Doesn't matter if it's state-owned or non-state-owned. If they're getting benefits, and as you said, many do that are non-state-owned, that's what needs to be addressed. We have in our survey a question on this every time about competing with Chinese companies, or competition in China for our membership. The competitor that is the greatest for U.S. companies over there are still other multinationals. Number 2 is going to be non-state companies, private companies in China, and number 3 is state-owned companies. So American companies are competing with all of those. But then we ask, all right, so are your state-owned competitors getting benefits that you don't? And the answer is overwhelmingly yes. Either they know it or they suspect it. What are those benefits that a state-owned competitor is getting? Well, it's in licenses, meaning the government approving them to do things that you can't get. It's in access to financing is another one. But when we go on and ask the same question, are your non-state-owned competitors, Chinese competitors, getting those benefits? The answer is also yes. Think of the solar companies that recently have been in the news here about unfair competition and maybe China providing subsidies and what it's done to that market and overseas competition. Those companies were not state-owned, but they were getting a lot of support from local governments over there. So I don't get too hung up on necessarily on whether it's state-owned or not. The test should be whether there's a benefit given there, whether it's state-owned or not, and that's where I think we need to keep the focus on, not just whether it's state-owned or not. A lot of the state-owned companies are getting monopoly rights. That's a different issue to me to be dealt with, but we really want to see that level playing field regardless of the ownership, and that's the other big thing that a bilateral investment treaty would do through its national treatment provisions.
Now, we're focused on investment. You mentioned level playing field. Often when we have that discussion in U.S. political circles, you get a focus on currency. Congress being vocal, and they were in the TPP context about currency manipulation. That's not something that played a particularly big role in your survey. How do we explain that?
It never has. For the last 10 years, when we ask our companies if the exchange rate is somehow a competitive barrier for what they can do in China, that direction, the answer has always been no. Okay. But certainly as well, over the last several years, China's exchange rate has strengthened dramatically against the dollar by 30+%, probably more than that if you look at it, including relative inflation rates. So to us, the exchange rate has never been probably the competitive problem that it's made out to be. It hasn't had that much impact probably on trade flows overall. A lot of what was imported from China, or we do import from China, basically replaced other imports. Think of a television set. It says Sony is on the TV set, and 15 years ago it was made in Japan, and flip around now and the label might say made in China, but it's still an import. It was an import before. So we think that the idea that somehow the exchange rate has been a major factor there has probably been overblown. Probably wouldn't change much the U.S. global trade imbalance anyway. But certainly with the 30% rise in China's currency over the last few years, we think even more so that's probably not a factor impacting U.S. employment or the U.S. situation as much as it's made out to.
Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to come to you guys for your questions. This is your 2-minute warning. Warm up and get ready. But I want to ask for the entire panel. We've talked a little bit about what the central role that a bilateral investment treaty might have, some of the things it might address, some of the barriers. You're welcome to return to those points, but I also wanted to get each of you to comment on, do you think that the political environment is right to have a sort of meaningful agreement between the U.S. and China right now on a bilateral investment treaty? And that can be the political environment either in the United States or in China, whichever you choose. So let me just sort of go down the row and each of you, your views on that.
Well, the climate in Washington on China is pretty negative by and large. And there is that backdrop. Certainly the cyber issues, the hacking into the Office of Personnel Management was a big one that colored a lot of perspectives in Washington. But let's not negotiate with ourselves. Let's get a good agreement, a high standard agreement, because that's what the objective is here. Not just a bit for the sake of getting a bilateral investment treaty, but it has to be a high standard agreement that addresses those issues I mentioned. If we get that, then the business community will come out and make a big push to sell it. And so let's see how that process evolves. As I said, a strong bilateral investment treaty would be a stepping stone getting China in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It would pick up a lot of the unfinished business from China's WTO entry. There's a lot of ways that a good agreement, I think, can potentially be sold. But you're absolutely right. It's going to have headwinds in Washington with the skepticism about China. But as I say, the focus ought to be on whether we can get that good agreement out of China. And that's where, to me, the biggest question mark is right now. Are they committed to those kinds of reforms and openings necessary to get that high standard agreement that would give business community support and perhaps be achievable in Washington, D.C.? And I think the jury is out on that right now. A lot of mixed signals from China on this reform process. We know there's not a consensus just yet. President Xi has made some bold statements about the overall direction, but the specifics on this matter. I think we're encouraged by some of what happened before President Xi's visit, where the Chinese negotiators did put on the table a lot of those sectors that have been closed for a long time and haven't been put on the table for a long time. Not enough to get a deal done yet, but enough for the U.S. side to say, well, they put enough on the table, well, let's try to accelerate this thing and get it done before the end of Obama's term.
Wait, Alan?
Yeah, well, when we look back for the last quarter of a century, in many ways, you can never say there is a good time for doing something like this. There are always going to be some political obstacles, but it's a process. It's a process whereby each side, and for our side, is really about American interest. On the Chinese side, they also want to protect their own interests. And so in that sense, actually, it's a negotiation process whereby each seeks to benefit from such a process. And when we do have increased interactions, increased trade and all that, Economics 101 emphasizes it's going to be beneficial to both sides. The issue is how you structure the deal and so on. So in that sense, I'm actually always an optimist in this case. But I do think there are some hiccups in terms of, for example, when you have a more complicated strategic environment, of course it spills over a little bit into the commercial side and so on. Domestically,
We're buzzing islands.
That's right, yeah, and all that. Domestically within China, however, Xi has done so much in terms of fighting against corruption, in terms of also consolidating his leadership, in terms of dealing with the military. So maybe now he can have a little more attention, a little more energy to the economic side. He left it actually really coast a little bit after passing the third plenum decision on essentially making market forces play a bigger role. Now I think they are beginning to realize they need to act on it. And in fact, a bilateral investment treaty could be one of those building blocks for making economic forces play a bigger role.
Thank you. Did you want to comment either on prospects or what's needed in this area?
No, I don't think I really have a lot to add to what John said. I think that the substance is obviously important. And I think the only fear of those of us who focus on substance is that even if you have the substance, that there is enough anti-business sentiment out there but I do think that the key is to be able to make a case to people in both countries that these kinds of changes are in the best interests of the countries as an economic perspective. And then if it goes off of substance into emotions, I don't know.
Okay, good. That's sort of a useful warning. Let me then invite questions from the audience. I'll ask you to identify yourselves, wait for the microphone, and if it's more of a statement, at least make an attempt to shape it like a question. We'll start right here, please.
Thank you. I'm Bob Calvin. Could you comment about the changing trade relationships between China and Russia and China and the UK?
Anyone want to take China and Russia or China and the UK?
Well, I can briefly comment on China and Russia in particular. Of course, it's a very lopsided relationship in many ways because Russia tends to emphasize supply of energy and all that. And even that relationship has been complicated. So sort of it took many years for China and Russia to strike a deal on energy supplies and so on. And even then, their fulfillment may be actually sort of questionable in certain respects. One of the pipelines appears to be actually sort of, there are some issues with that. And as a result, in the beginning also Chinese businessmen exporting to Russia in the 1990s ruined their reputation quite a bit. So there is quite a bit of distrust among Russians of Chinese exports as well. But it's a very complicated relationship in some ways. But overall, though, there's a lot of aspects that are very complementary between the two sides. But it's not one of the most important relations. You look at the numbers, they're simply not there. China does want to diversify its energy supply, so having Russia as an energy partner is very important. It really wants the Middle East, wants the other parts of the world, and also wants Russia in terms of mitigating security considerations in that regard. There have been, however, Russian technicians working in China, especially on the military side, and that has been a boon to China. In terms of the UK, I think it's very interesting because the UK is positioning itself as the most friendly country to China. And I think they want, for example, the recent deal is really making London, to cement London's role as the financial hub in terms of trading in the renminbi and so on. So that's very important. They have welcomed Chinese investors more so than the Americans, allowing, for example, Huawei, which has not been able to make significant deals in terms of telecom infrastructure in the U.S. to invest in the UK. And of course, the Li Ka-shing family itself owns about 5% of the infrastructure in the UK. This is the Hong Kong tycoon. That in itself is extremely interesting. And the Chinese, with the President Xi's recent visit to the UK, of course, the government of China is making a major move to try to position China as a significant investor in the UK. So it's a very significant warming relationship. And it's a little delicate in this regard. In fact, it's ironic to have the Chinese president urging the British prime minister, urging the British leadership to stay in Europe, to stay in the EU. So you wonder about those kind of things in this regard. But it's a little bit ironic because in bending backwards practically in sort of welcoming the Chinese, it makes the relationship between London and Washington a little bit delicate. But I think, of course, the transatlantic relationship are extraordinarily strong, so I don't think we should be worried about that.
Thank you. Next question, right up here, please.
How come whenever the subject of investing in China comes up, why would you say that environmental issues tend to get brought up?
You're talking about when China's investing in the U.S. or the U.S. investing in China?
U.S. investing in China.
So in the role of environmental issues when the U.S. invests in China. Is this a significant consideration?
I'm not sure I understand fully the angle you're going at there, but a couple of comments about environmental issues in China. China's environment's gotten bad enough now where it's increasingly hard to get expatriate American executives to locate there, particularly with families. And that's come up in our survey as well, and we actually have a specific question on it. So it's adding to those HR challenges that I mentioned earlier. But the interesting thing about U.S. companies and environmental impact, if I take it down to the micro level, is that U.S. companies bring their global best practices to a facility they set up in China pretty regularly. And that's always been, I think, a positive impact of American investment over there because they've brought standards that usually exceed what's required locally. And so they've been, I think, kind of models in how you deal with remediation of sites, for example, with the type of equipment you put in there. And for a long time, U.S. companies, because they wanted to make sure they had the same standards in whatever facility they had around the world, for a long time they felt like that put them at a competitive disadvantage in China because the competitor down the road maybe wasn't doing that and maybe wasn't getting the scrutiny from the environmental regulators, the domestic competition versus what U.S. companies are doing. So it's been a long-term irritant from U.S. companies that they were following the rules, they were bringing in and adhering to the standards, and lots of times their competition wasn't and getting away with it. That's changing a bit with the emphasis on the environment. And I guess it was in the spring, whenever I go out, I always try to convene operating executives in a roundtable session, whether it's in Beijing, Shanghai, or anywhere else. And there was one guy who cited this as perhaps a sign of the seriousness of the Chinese authorities about trying to clean up the environment. His company has about, I don't know, close to 20 facilities around China. So this isn't just a one-off, but in various provinces. And he said they've pretty much seen across the board now their competition being required to also meet environmental regulations where they hadn't before. And that was suddenly changing the cost competitiveness profile as well, and they thought that that was a sign of a change that they hadn't seen for years before. Suddenly, over the last 12 months, taking a turn for the better.
May I add, in this case, the Chinese laws on the books used to be very weak. At the end of last year, the Chinese legislature enacted new laws, and which actually earlier last year, they came into effect this year with the environmental protection law and also other laws. As a result, the environmental bureaucracy is much more vigorous. And President Xi himself actually brought in a new minister, the former president of Tsinghua University, trusted person, and he has the political clout. So it used to be local authorities simply went on their own ways and not listening, not paying attention. Now, in fact, when the Ministry of Environmental Protection calls in local leaders for a chat, it's called actually just requesting a meeting, which means it's a reprimand. And then local authorities, the local leaders go back home. Suddenly, they decide the environment is the only thing they want to care now. So they are shutting down factories, doing all sorts of things just to maintain their record, and this has happened in a number of cities. It's truly remarkable in that regard. We actually have a number of initiatives at the University of Chicago in terms of talking with the Chinese. They are extremely interested in best practices. We have a dialogue with Tsinghua University, in fact. The Post Institute itself is very engaged with sustainability issues in China.
Good, thank you. All right, another question, please. Right here, please.
Hi, my question is, since the labor costs in China become more and more expensive in this couple of years, so a lot of corporations, they start moving their factories to Southeast Asia. So do you think the number of that gonna dramatically increase in the next 5 to 10 years? And how's gonna impact China's economy?
So are we seeing U.S. businesses move out of China to sort of Southeast Asia, I think pursuing, as labor costs rise in China, or are they pursuing different kinds of businesses in China, either or?
Sure. In my view, there's always been two different types of foreign investors and American investors in China. Those that went there for a low-cost export platform versus those who are there for the China market. Our membership and most American companies that are doing direct investment in China tend to be in the latter camp. They're investing there for the China market. So that's why they're there, and they will stay there. And that's why in our surveys you don't see significant numbers of companies at all that are seeking to relocate out of China. But you do for those who went there for a low-cost platform to make export products. And those have tended to be not so much American companies themselves. I mean, yes, you see these products in Walmart's shelves, for example, but they're sourced from what have usually been companies from other parts of Asia. And I mentioned the Japan example, how they made television sets in Japan, but now they make them in China. You can look at the Korean companies doing the same thing. You can look at Taiwan. You can look at Hong Kong. They moved that export production that was directed at the U.S. market or the EU market from those economies onto the Chinese mainland when China first opened up. Low-cost labor was the big driver there. And it was literally, in some cases, you bring in the components, you assemble it. This is what the iPhone still does now, and then you export it. Well, if it was really based upon low-cost labor as the main input, if you think about clothing, if you think about low-end products, yeah, a lot of that is shifting elsewhere. Where's the next low-cost place to do it? Vietnam, Bangladesh, Indonesia, you tell me. I suspect that kind of investment is moving and has moved. But if there's a component there about trying to reach the China market, that probably means you're going to stay in China.
Let me pick up on that a little, because you're talking about sort of the China market and those who are trying to serve that. One of the major sort of economic reorientation goals of China has been trying to turn from an investment-driven economy to one that gave a much greater role to consumption, which would presumably play to the interests of those serving the China market. Are we seeing that kind of reorientation? This is for either of you. Are we seeing that kind of reorientation? Are they progressing along those lines?
Well, I was reading something from an analyst, Andy Rothman, who I think is pretty good. He works for Matthews Asia now, but he's a long-time economist based in China. He said in the third quarter of this year, for the first time, I think it was, China, the services sector of China's economy was greater than the manufacturing sector. Now, whether that's reflecting manufacturing weakness or a combination of that plus services sector growth, I don't know. But yes, they are trying to make that shift. But they still have an economy that has a services sector that is below what you would expect, from other international benchmarks, and certainly economies like the U.S., of course, at the
You're including
other
a bigger
extreme.
services sector with more consumption domestically. than
Yes.
is often locally.
So they're trying to move away from fixed asset investment as a big driver, export as a big driver, to one that has more domestic consumption, domestic demand. To get there, you're going to have to see a greater share of the economy in the services sector. It's certainly a priority. It also ties in with green growth because services economy, of course, is less polluting than the manufacturing sector. And it also fits in with the rebalancing away from perhaps the blind investment into state companies, where a lot of that just went into more capacity. And I mentioned earlier that overcapacity is a big issue for, say, companies in the materials sector. Think Alcoa, for example, where that overinvestment has led to too much capacity and contributed to some of the price drops that we've seen. So all of that is part of the rebalancing agenda that China has. They're getting there slowly. Some economists feel that they are taking steps in that direction. Others are feeling like they're not yet tackling the biggest issues that they need to get there.
So a lot of the changes are not necessarily simply because the government wants to do it, but simply out of necessity. Companies took on so much debt in recent years and very often were given a lot of credit by the state banks. Now they are left holding, in fact, including some of the private companies that were urged to expand during the boom years and now suddenly are left with a lot of capacity that they couldn't use. Foxconn, which is one anecdote I have is Foxconn, which is the leading supplier to Apple in terms of assembling the iPhones and so on. In order to have enough workers, moved some of its operations inland in China. For example, one of the places they went to is Henan province. Arguably, China's either the most populous or the second most populous province. But they thought they would have a much easier time recruiting workers. But when they set up shop, they needed to do all the assembly. The local governments actually sometimes urged office workers to go to spend some time on the assembly line because they couldn't get enough labor for a while. So that's the kind of situation China faces because the demographic transition is happening. And as a result, you just don't have as many people who are willing to do the kind of assembly line work, especially because college education has dramatically increased. How many college graduates wants to work on assembly line? So as a result, Foxconn is considering setting up shop in India, which of course has a different set of challenges and so on. And I think so you see this again playing out in many sectors. Sometimes it's because of labor supply issues. Very often today, however, especially in the Pearl River Delta, it is actually really profit margins. The margins have come down significantly for many of those companies. And their best investment happened to be very often the land that they leased from the local government. So in those cases, what better to do than simply to sort of phase out the operations and so on. And that has been the source of some of the worker strikes in recent months in the Pearl River Delta and also to some extent in the Yangtze River Delta. So we do see quite a number of changes, but at the same time, the trade, the exports are simply not growing as much. Though the silver lining is imports have also shrunk because oil prices and so on have dramatically come down. As a result, China still makes a significant surplus on trade. And so it's a lot of the adjustments are made by necessity today.
All right, we have time for one last question. Let's go to the back here.
Andrew Jean-Blanc. I have a question, there's a couple different points on cooperation. So first, this may just be due to my not completely understand the situation, but right now with the current situation in Syria with ISIS and you know, the terrorism there, I was just wondering if there's any opportunity for China and the U.S. to cooperate, just given obviously concerns in, you know, Xinjiang and the Uyghur population, and maybe bringing in, you know, sort of helping to, you know, what would you say, increase or you know, domestic terrorism or so forth. So one poorly stated question is there any cooperation right now on ISIS between the U.S. and China? Is that something that could develop? Another question was, I had read recently that there was the rail between, high-speed rail between LA and Las Vegas that was potentially going to be having some, the Chinese railway ministry or some Chinese know-how involved to develop that, possibly ahead of, you know, Elon Musk's high-speed rail in California. So I was just wondering if that is a project that is going to be proceeding, and if you saw that as maybe something that could help as far as developing the China brand in the U.S. And lastly, I was just wondering when you thought, you know, following up on the question about the UK, I saw the recent selfie floating around WeChat with, I think it was Cameron and President Xi. When do you anticipate the Chinese president and the US president will be able to take their first selfie?
All right. Thank you. Let's go with the first two. So opportunities for strategic cooperation, and also maybe in particular, are there issues that arise when we talk about infrastructure investment in the U.S.? We've had this sort of on bridges, but also potentially in the Elon Musk thing. Maybe Dali, you could take the any chance for strategic cooperation, you know, in hotspots around the world.
Actually, let me begin with two very quick points. Number one, China has been known as Mr. Abstention in the UN Security Council for many years. On many decisions in the UN Security Council, China would rather not take a stand rather than stick out its neck one way or the other, actually. So that is changing in some way. Among the 5 UN Security Council members, China has the largest peacekeeping force around the world, including in the Sudan and other places in the Central America and so on. So as a result, China also has started to realize it actually, as the economy has grown, as Chinese have reached out across the globe, it also, its legitimate interests have also grown. For example, Afghanistan is an excellent example. It's right on China's border. Why should the US be spending so much money and human capital stabilizing Afghanistan when it's right next to China? So China already invests, it likes to invest and profit economically. So in fact, in the last couple of years in particular, the US and China has been talking to each other. And in fact, there are fairly regular meetings, I think, in terms of discussing the situation and collaborating a little bit in Afghanistan. The other aspect is, in fact, you mentioned Xinjiang. There have been Chinese who actually wanted to get themselves smuggled out to join, for example, radical extremist organizations. In fact, when the US launched this attack on against the Taliban, some of the people who were caught in Afghanistan after 9/11 were Chinese nationals from Xinjiang. So there is an interest. China does not want those people actually to sort of to join those extremist organizations, especially to come back to China to cause trouble. There have been some attacks. Of course, there have been some criticism of Chinese government action, but in recent months, however, the Chinese government has caught smuggling groups trying to smuggle people, Uyghurs actually, who wanted to leave China to join this kind of organizations. So in that case, actually, obviously, we have an interest again, in working with China, even though the Xinjiang question generally has been a little delicate in terms of relations. But generally speaking, also, the US government from fairly early on recognized the East Turkestan group as a terrorist organization, put it on the terrorist list, although there has been some criticism of that. So I think actually China has a genuine interest in trying to stabilize the situation. And let's also not forget that China is the single largest importer of Middle Eastern oil now. And of course, again, it has a very strong interest in reaching out, in trying to stabilize the Middle East. So I think actually increasingly, the US and China have an interest in working with each other, even though we don't always see eye to eye on some of those issues.
Thank you. John, last word on infrastructure type investment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not specifically familiar with what you're talking about, but it is different, I think, than the kind of things that we worry about at CFIUS, where you're talking about the acquisition of existing infrastructure. I think what you're talking about sounds to me like the difference, which I think is clearly true here and probably anywhere else in the world, between trying to do business with the government, because this is probably a government-funded project, and the government is going to have different, they act rationally but differently than the private sector does. And so I think that just like US companies may find themselves at a disadvantage if they're trying to compete for government contracts elsewhere in the world, I think that's the sort of issue that the Chinese company may face if it's trying to compete with US or other technologies in a government-funded project to build a high-speed rail, from Los Angeles to Las Vegas. And in fact, and I'll finish this by saying, one of our clients, after completing an acquisition, wound up divesting a piece of the business that they bought because it was so dependent upon government revenue for its success, and they were just running into sort of a constant reluctance to engage, because once that division was owned by a Chinese company, the governments that they were trying to do business with were just not as interested in doing business with them. It was an additional barrier, and so they ultimately just got out of that business.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have time for
Wait,
this evening.
can I answer the selfie question, though?
Okay, yeah, selfie. Quick, selfie, what do we have?
U.S. and China have been cooperating a lot in Iran, too, and I think there's been, that's been one of the highlights that the administration has cited over the past couple of years. On the selfie question, I don't know, but I do know that there'll be some opportunities coming up. Two presidents will see each other again in the Philippines next month around the margins of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit there, so that's one opportunity to take your recommendation. And there will be another meeting of our presidents probably a year from now, the last opportunity, obviously, before President Obama leaves office. The G20 will be held in China in 2016 in Hangzhou, and the president, I believe, is committed, obviously, to go there, and that may be where they do their next summit. So sometime between those two, maybe there'll be other opportunities too, but your selfie dream may get fulfilled.
So stay tuned, watch your Instagram accounts, and please join me in thanking the panel.